I'm Ed Nersessian, director of the Helix Center. I will mention today's program and the future programs, and then John Williams, who's a member of the Helix Committee, will introduce the speakers, and then we get going. So today's program is on why we write. And then on March 7th, we have one on where have all the isms gone, on the evolution of knowledge. And then on April 18th, we have one on medicine and artificial intelligence. So, John?
I'll try to speak a little louder. Is that better? Okay. Indeed. Okay. Why we write. We have a very distinguished group of panelists today for our roundtable conversation. I'm going to introduce them with abbreviated bios. I would encourage you to consult the entire descriptions of their work on the program. But for the sake of those that are watching as we live stream on YouTube, I will give a brief introduction, and then we'll start the conversation. As you know, this is not a format of Q&A or even prepared conversations. It is something of a free-flowing conversation among the panelists, and we are privileged enough to sort of overhear what goes on. I'll begin with Paul Fry. Paul Fry began teaching at Yale in 1971. His primary fields are British Romanticism, the history of criticism, literary theory and literature, and painting. He's also a painter and has written art criticism for Art News, The Poet's Calling in the English Ode. His other book received the Melville Cain Award of the Poetry Society of America. His online lecture course, Introduction to Literary Theory, can be viewed as an open Yale lecture course on YouTube. I recently checked it this morning, and it has over 1,300,000 views. So for a lecture on literary
How do you
theory,
sleep at night?
that's quite the accomplishment.
Wow.
For many years, he was executive co-director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute and its national counterpart, the Yale National Initiative. In addition to the book mentioned above, with a Coleridge edition and many articles and reviews, he has also written The Reach of Criticism, William Empson, Prophet Against Sacrifice, A Defense of Poetry, Wordsworth and the Poetry of What We Are, and Theory of Literature. Moving on, Eric Lindstrom is a professor of English at the University of Vermont. He teaches courses across literary studies and publishes scholarship in the areas of romantic and modern poetry, literary theory, ordinary language philosophy, and on the novels of Jane Austen. He's the author of over 30 essays and reviews and editor of 2 scholarly special journal issues, Stanley Cavell and the Event of Romanticism, and Ostensive Movements and the Romantic Arts. He's currently co-editing for Routledge an historical companion on lyric in the long 19th century, and a proposed New Modern Language Association volume on teaching Romantic poetry in the 21st century. Joe Luzzi is the Asher B. Edelman Professor of Literature at Bard College and the author of 9 books, including the recent The Innocents of Florence, The Renaissance Rediscovery of Childhood from Norton, and Botticelli's Secret, The Lost Drawings and the Rediscovery of the Renaissance. Both were New Yorker Best Books of the Year selections, and Botticelli's Secret was also shortlisted for the Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award. Other books include Romantic Europe and the Ghost of Italy, A Cinema of Poetry, My Two Italies, and In a Dark Wood, What Dante Taught Me About Grief, Healing, and the Mysteries of Love. It's a very moving memoir, actually, which I recommend highly to everyone. Honor Moore is a prize-winning poet and memoirist living and writing in New York City. A Termination, 2024, an account of her pre-Roe abortion and how that act of resistance shaped and allowed who she became, was published by A Public Space and was a New York Times editor's choice, and appeared on Best of the Year lists at Publishers Weekly and the Boston Globe. The audiobook will appear next month. Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Mid-Century, from 2020, was published 2 days before the COVID-19 lockdown, and its book tour was one of the first conducted over Zoom, a Zoom pioneer, as it were. She has many more publications, which I encourage you to consult as well. Elizabeth Birkeland is the author of A Northern Light in Provence, published last year by Random House. The Runaway Wife, and The Dressmaker, with editions in the UK, Germany, and Russia, and several film options. Prior to writing novels, Elizabeth was the personal finance columnist for Cosmopolitan magazine and a full-time freelance writer for national magazines, including Glamour, Self, Victoria, Working Woman, and Institutional Investor. A graduate of Brown University, she studied comparative literature, which included a semester at the Sorbonne. Elizabeth has served on the boards of the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle NC and the Center for Fiction in New York. And finally, last but not least, Michael Frank's essays, articles, book reviews, and short stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Slate, the Yale Review, and many others. And his fiction has been presented at Symphony's Space Selected Shorts, a celebration of the short story. He served as a contributing writer to the Los Angeles Times Book Review for nearly 8 years. He's the author of What is Missing, a novel, and The Mighty Franks, a memoir which was awarded the 2018 J.Q. Wingate Prize and was named as one of the best books of the year by The Telegraph and The New Statesman. His most recent book, 100 Saturdays, was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2022 by the Wall Street Journal and received a Nathan Notable Book Award. Please join me in welcoming our 6 panelists to this conversation. So, why we write? Feel free to begin.
I guess I'm the oldest of 9 children, so I always seem to begin. I guess my first question is, who is we? And I think there's a kind of cross-cultural, transnational, multilinguistic we who write. But I had an experience this week. I teach the graduate program at the New School, creative writing, and I had this student. I knew she was Iranian, and she looked kind of upset after class the other week, and I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Well, not really," and like an idiot. I mean, I was sort of in Proust or something. I wasn't, and I said, "Why?" And she said, "My country." And this was 2 weeks ago. And I said, "I'm so sorry that I didn't, come up with that initially." And I said, this class is very flexible. Any way you want to put that experience into your prompts or your conversation or whatever is fine with me. But I did think of her in the car coming across town, who is we, and that her we would be under more stress or a different extreme stress than mine or perhaps any of ours here. So
it's hard to top that.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of not topping, but it just
parallel, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, because that we is also a child who can express whatever he's living, or an old person who hasn't been able to, at the end of life, to come to some terms with a personal point of view. I mean, I read this study once I thought was so interesting, that they'd sort of measured degrees of peace at the end of life and talked to people who had told, in some ways, formulated the story of their lives versus people who had never been able to. And it's not surprising which one led to a greater peace of mind. It seems so straightforward, but it's not that easy to make a narrative out of your life,
No.
and very hard to do it accurately. Of course, that's the whole other part of the conversation. But
well, we also raises the question whether or not it's fair to use the word anthropological when we want to know. I mean, we always wonder why our ancestors drew pictures of buffaloes on the walls of caves. I mean, they presumably had better things to do, but they wasted their time drawing pictures of buffaloes. And we ask ourselves why. And to me, it's tempting to think of a kind of compulsion, le besoin d'écrire, the need to write, which I don't think it follows from that there is then an anthropologically universal motive? Obviously, there is not. There are perhaps as many motives as there are people, although maybe they could be dealt with taxonomically. But in any case, something, and I'm not sure that it needs to be confined to writing, although I wouldn't dream of venturing on the topic of music, which I feel that I couldn't say anything about. But I think that it might extend from the scribbling of writing to the doodling of painting as something compulsory in our nature. Well, might pursue that in other contexts, but maybe that for a first contribution.
But, Paul, compulsory, if I just hear it, kind of has a, I want to say negative associated. In other words, not necessarily meaningful, but something that's a reflex, an instinct. Do you see it as something that could move in a more positive direction, or?
Well, I threatened to you earlier that I would say something about Byron, and I think in this, I mean, I could say something about Dr. Johnson, who said, "No man but a blockhead would ever have written except for money." Now, that would be another way of venturing on the topic. But what Byron does in the first canto of Don Juan represents Juan's first affair with a married woman named Donna Julia, who, for her transgression, is thrown into a nunnery, and the whole plot gets a lot like Eloisa and Abelard, and she writes Juan a letter. And in the letter she says, "I trace this scrawl because I cannot rest. I have nothing to reproach or to request." In other words, there's no real purpose in what I'm writing. I just have to write. I trace this scrawl. And she associates it with being unable to rest, as though there were a kind of overload, almost a sensory overload in her mind that needed somehow or another to be sort of toned down or maybe even emptied out by the process of writing. So I give that as an example of what seems compulsory, yet at the same time is, I would think, positively necessary, just as it was for Eloise writing to Abelard.
Well, I could say a little bit about that, given that I was starting writing at about 8 or 9 years old. So it's always been a mystery why other people just enjoy their lives. And I have to write. And I did ask my mother about this question recently, why we write, why I did write. And she said, your stories in the early days were about, this is third grade, second grade, were about an animal missing something. And I was thinking, well, maybe, the zebra without the stripes, and they were a kind of Jungle Book, the peacock without, and maybe it was a way to resolve something that was missing, but it definitely, and then I was wondering if I became addicted to that, back to your compulsory thing, that I needed it as a way of resolving what might be missing. But this is a rational mind talking. This isn't the irrational mind, which is just, it's something you have to do and you do it. But
if I could just add to that, when we got the prompt for this session, maybe this reflects badly on me, but instead of thinking why we write, I thought the question is, why do I write? So I started thinking, why do I write? And I really couldn't answer the question, maybe just because it's become a habit, it's something that I do. But I'll tell you a little anecdote that I think does relate to this idea of compulsion and something missing, is that after my last book, and now I've had several, for the first time, I don't know why, I took all my books and I put them on a bookshelf together, as in like the little body of work. And I felt, in a way, it was like trying to, I think some writers write sort of out of a lack, and then some writers as an enhancement of their life and as an overflow of experience. And to me, these books kind of represent a physical instantiation of something necessary to my life, like a kind of record, rescuing from the oblivion of time these experiences. They're set in text and they're there, and they feel kind of necessary. Now, is that a compulsion or a desire to make something meaningful? It's hard for me to answer that, but it does feel somehow necessary. And there's a physical embodiment of experience in those books that stand out to me as the author.
It's possible that if you didn't write, you wouldn't know that you existed.
Maybe it's my own pathology, but I need, from all the flux and chaos of life, this is proof that I've done something with my time, to me, and that means something to me. So maybe, I don't know where that comes from, but...
I like to think of writing as making something. I mean, poetry, the base is a word about making, and so is fiction, and therefore so is nonfiction, and actually creating. And I actually think of it that way. I think of it, it's displacing something from myself to the world or to outside. And it reminds me, Peter Sachs, in his book, The English Elegy, talks about elegy as the mourner creating something to replace what's lost. And, time is lost, experience is lost.
Childhood.
What?
Childhood.
Childhood, and but as one goes on, every chunk of time
Yesterday.
is lost.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
the writing, making something from it makes it less, painful and meaningless. And I'm not talking exactly about physical books, although that's another thing. I'm actually talking about entities which then have an independent life from me, even if I write a lot of autobiography, but it still feels like other than myself.
I'm flashing on this image of Eudora Welty, who used to rewrite and rearrange her stories by retyping them,
Yeah.
because there is a kind of materiality, even if
Yes.
the books don't forever live in the world. But there's something about touching language, whether it's a visual touch or a physical touch or turning the page touch, that I think concretizes this insanity that is constantly in motion inside, this chaos.
And I just wanted to add something to that. So I resist when people say, "Oh, it must have been so healing to write that book." It's like, no.
That's a different conversation.
Yeah. All of that I kind of resist.
There's an element of this that is fierce and almost tragic. I mean, we're talking about loss, and then I'm finding myself drawn to writers. A poet, James Schuyler, I'm working on, and I'm not a Stein expert, but I'm sure we all had things that we somewhat excitedly and frantically grabbed from our libraries when we got this wonderful unanswerable prompt, for which the audience would be equally great respondents as certainly me. And I picked up Stein's How Writing is Written, which is a conundrum of a title, but I also was looking for an answer. And in one of the pieces in there, I forget which one, it was one of the lectures in America, Stein described, I'm assuming writing, as the having of everything that she had never had. And also that was the description of America. And it was a witticism like the famous, overly famous, there's no there
Right.
in Oakland, but it was also something about a word that for me at least could get a little menacing because I'm not in the digital humanities and I'm probably pointed backwards in time just as a person, but the sense that like virtuality is something that literature and poetry and maybe fiction have always kind of provided us, and it's like non-tragic. Like it's not an oxymoron for Stein to say that their writing is the having of everything that they had never had.
Right.
it's true, maybe anthropologically true, but something about the virtuality of even the material production of writing. It's so satisfying, as Keats says, to write your dreams on vellum leaf. No one can say you're not a poet. Anyone can write their dreams on vellum leaf, he says at the opening of the Fall of Hyperion. But even with that physical object, there's something virtual about it. And it is the having of what we've never had, I think, especially because writers are.
It's also the recreating of what reality could be for you. So it's this life that you can take on so many lives at once. So she could have endless lives, really, as many as she creates. And I guess that's, speaking of your Proust, that's what Proust is after, right? It's never as good as what he recreates. The reality is always disappointing. Which he admits. Right.
You know.
It's all, his idea is everything is projection. I mean, I've just come through a 7.5-year cycle of reading the whole Search with this group of eccentric people, wonderful people, and we just kept coming back again and again. The fact that absolutely nothing measures up for him. Right. It's all in his head. It's all in his language, you know, and that's where his aliveness or his contentment, if you could call him content, the narrators, that is, seems to reside in this imagined reality. And it's true for him. It's true for Swan. It's true for so many characters in the book.
But he also talks about, in the first volume, there's that extraordinary passage on reading, and he talks about how if you live something, you know, this happens this month, this happens 2 weeks later, this, you know, this happened yesterday. It's, he says, and it takes the novelist, by which he means the writer, to render this so that the reader can actually feel it. I mean, and that's a kind of slightly you know, it's grandiose, but there's also truth to it. I mean, the experience of reading an experience is different from living it and has its own reality.
There's also a compulsion to read. I mean, it's tempting to say, well, there's a whole parallel discussion available about why we read, the nature of what we read, and the conditions in which we read. I mean, I think we've been wise, by and large, at least so far, to avoid media history and the question, what are the circumstances of writing? Is one using a pen on vellum paper? Is one dictating to a typist? Is one oneself typing? Typing on a computer, dictating to a computer, and meaningful change among these moments in media history? Possibly, by the way, the answer is no. There's somehow or another an underlying feeling of the relationship between what you're doing and what emerges that isn't so specifically media dependent, but obviously a lot of people have taken up that part of the issue as well and thought about it. So.
I'm curious how many of you keep diaries or journals, because to me that's the most immediate way to try to hold experience, even maybe not at its most organized.
Unfaithfully.
Unfaithfully, but when certain intense emotions seem to provoke it.
Or intense experience, sequences of experience.
Exactly, yeah.
Unevenly, but intensely.
In my old age, I have been doing a lot of writing, I think, more or less intentionally, not for publication, which in a way puts a different spin on the notion of the product. I've written a long screed on being old, for example, which I think has no possible outlet. I've just finished writing something called Why Crosswords Laugh at Poetry. I don't think there's probably a future in a topic of that nature. And so, but it brings out the notion of compulsion that I've been talking about. Why do I do this if I have no conceivable externalization in mind for it?
Isn't it company?
It is company, yes.
It's also trying to get to the truth or something that's deeper than, isn't it? Something seeking
Yeah.
some kind of essence of who you are. And
Yes, and also I mean, in the case of being old, well, what is that like? And how can I know if I don't write through it in order to perhaps get to the other side of some of the more opaque confrontations in the mirror? And in other cases, I find that it's a return to things that I have thought about in my publishing life, but that now I'm finding more idiosyncratic ways of sort of slanting what were more or less respectably organized academic topics. And so, but in all of those cases, of course, there's continued self-understanding. And as you say, I think quite rightly, company.
Yeah.
I mean, one has human company as well. But
Anna, what about you? Do you keep a diary or a journal, a regular writing practice like that?
Only, I used to, and then Grace Paley said, don't keep a diary or you'll never write stories. And I thought, and that's when I sort of stopped doing it regularly, or poems, or whatever you were writing. However, now I've found the journals that I have kept to be useful when
Yes,
I'm
exactly. Right.
writing about things. And then I did, there were some significant things happening in my life that I thought, oh, I think I'll keep a journal during this period. And so I've done that. And I talk into my phone, and so it's sort of dribs and drabs.
So I keep a diary pretty much every day, and I'm like a proselytizer with all the young people I know, my nephew, my daughter. I'm like, go write it down, because the thing that I found is that I just don't have the kind of brain that remembers the texture of the past, the way you will put things down in real time, and you're so unaware of what you're doing because you're just absorbing the atmosphere around you, making a daily record, political, the weather, your internal weather, what you're reading, what you're wearing, what you're eating, all of it. And it ends up becoming a kind of historical document that can be incredibly useful when you're going back to try to write stories, I think. So I don't agree, with all due respect, with Grace Paley on that one.
But in a way, it's almost like, it seems like there's two kinds of writing. Like there's, if you keep a journal, a diary, or something, a compulsion, a personal compulsion, and then if you're writing a book, right? And you know it's not really, it's for you in that you're writing it, but you're writing it for other people. And it's almost like that's the difference. I think of writing a book for a reader. You know, for example, coming through the scholarly tradition as an academic, I would be writing for other academics. And then the transition to writing for general readers, you get into a dialogue and a conversation, and it's kind of an anonymous one because you don't know them all. But there is a sense that you're writing for a reader, and it's personal, but it doesn't live under a lock of a diary. I don't know.
But I would venture that any writer who keeps a diary is never 100% sure that what he's writing is private. I mean, let's get real, people. You're leaving behind language, and you know, and you know, if you're, I think there's craft involved even in the daily entry, personally. But I mean, not at the expense or exclusion of then writing a book or looking to it as maybe a foundation for a book. But I think that if you're a practiced writer, you know, on the level of the paragraph, you're already hearing what it is you're doing. You know, the craft comes.
I totally get it. I guess my question would be this: Is there something a switch that goes off in your head? For example, let's say you're writing a book that's clearly not just for you.
Sure, because you're in different voices all the time, depending on the genre, or aren't you? Don't you think you are?
Well, I'll ask a question by analogy. If you have some friends that do writers groups, and for me, that would just be so alien to go in a group and just write for the pleasure of writing. Like I wouldn't, because I don't write for that. Like I write to produce a book that other people will read, not as an end in itself. And in other words, there are people for whom the writing process is a wonderful experience, and that's their end game, and I admire and respect that. But that's a mindset that, for me, is hard to get into. I don't know how the rest of you feel.
I think that's a great question, and so I'm like a poet manqué, or whatever. Like I stopped writing poetry and I went to graduate school. But one of the feats of being an employed academic who writes is to somehow keep that person alive, kind of not so secretly, often in the rejections I get, but still like that writer is still alive. They're not dead in me, as Coleridge sadly said he felt they were. And what am I getting at? I think I've never understood the audience thing, and I think that the question about I've lost it. I've really lost it. But the question about that basic writing for another has always been a bit of a ground zero leap for me. And so it's really intriguing to hear others speak about it. And now I've found it again. The reason I lost it is because it's about other people and other minds. And I was thinking about poetry in particular, something that you imagine there's a leap almost into song, this metaphor, conceit, rarely true of George Herbert or Bob Dylan or whatever. But like, there's that sense that I couldn't imagine, even in my own throttled academic prose, writing the next sentence without pleasure. Writing for me is very pleasuring, even if it's not pleasuring to my reader or whatever. And so I think of that as the poet's way of going. And one of my questions for the group, honestly, for all of us as human beings, is like, how do you judge your own writing? Is it pleasure that gets you from one word to the next, or one thought from the next? Or is it, as you're saying, Joe, something else that really is truly anchored in an audience that you feel like you can confidently reach? And even though I'm an academic writer, I have no way to go from one sentence to the next besides pleasure. And it made me think of all the different varieties. It honestly made me think of Eve Sedgwick in this great introduction called Axiomatic in Sedgwick's book about sexuality, Epistemology of the Closet. And the second of the axioms in Axiomatic is there are just so many different ways of doing sexuality, even for people that might be outwardly described as of the same, I think there are so many different ways of doing writing, and whether you take pleasure in it is maybe like the first one, as it is for Sedgwick, when Sedgwick is talking about that. And I thought that's like too true for me.
Yeah.
This kind of brings back what you were saying about company.
Yeah.
And what is it about your writing that is company, the other?
Yeah.
So the audience, in a way, is, well, you're bringing out the other in yourself, and that other is, in a way, the company. Well, in fiction, anyway, I find that it is stretching to the other. And we all are, in a way, so unique. So you're stretching to who you are as the unique being. That's for me in fiction. And the craft comes for me in the rewrite. And many people.
That's like a first draft
Yeah.
process, right? Because then there's another.
And then
whole
there's the
experience
rewrite,
involved.
which is the
Then there's
craft.
the making, right?
Yeah.
And just building on that, I'll throw this out to the group. I was talking with a friend a while ago, and we just started thinking, he's like, well, what do you think are the best novels ever written? Just one of those questions. And I went down and I sat down and made a little list. And I realized, these are like the heavyweights, like War and Peace, The Brothers Karamazov, Middlemarch, Moby Dick, The Usual Suspects, and Proust. And I realized that all of them had long stretches of difficult, tedious passages. James Joyce's Ulysses, like all of them had areas of inaccessibility that things maybe a modern editor would get rid of. And then I thought, they're writing at a different plane. They're not writing for the reader. They're writing in a sense of, they're just channeling their own idea of uncompromising form that is not reader-friendly at all. And they're still extraordinary works. They're the greatest works. But they clearly weren't written to communicate.
I'm not sure I agree with
disagree.
Okay.
that. You go first.
I think all of those books that you mentioned, they're creating another world. It goes back to the thing of making. They're making another universe that reflects their belief, imagining of a universe that we are lucky to be able to enter, 200 years later.
Also, they're writing in a different time where there's no other, there are fewer other forms of entertainment.
Right.
A lot of them are writing in serial form, so they're filling weekly installments or weekly expectations. I think there's a size and dimension component of that. And sure, they couldn't keep that plot up or as taut as it could be on every page. Proust himself, that 125-page dinner party that could kill you, but he just was determined to take us to that dinner party, and he's probably the most, supports what you're saying more than anyone because of the lack of checks and balances to a certain point, but they still were published. He still had readers. People passed on them, and people took them, people ran with them, people responded to them. So
Edited them.
yeah,
year
edited
after
them,
year.
sort of. Yeah, they edited him. Sure, not at the end, but yeah. So I think context is important. Important there. Our brains are maybe wired differently now, but everyone is happy when a certain kind of novel of a certain length and breadth and loose bagginess, if you will, comes along and can convince us, and hold us. I think it's still a viable object to put into the world.
So when we pursue the pleasure and satisfaction of making and shaping a world and shaping our experience, shaping the experience that we imagine in others, I think that in fascinating ways, we're edging near the opposite question. Why do we fail to write? What happens when we have writer's block? When the compulsion to write suddenly becomes the inability to write, the possible frustration ensuing on that, possible at least temporary relief ensuing on that, but some form of blockage that suddenly stands between ourselves and the process to which we're not only accustomed, but perhaps in some sense not addicted, but feel the need of. And I don't know how many of all the people who write, and all the people who scribble, Gibbon, another fat book, Gibbon. I don't know what percentage of those people actually have the calamitous psychological experience of writer's block. I'm not sure I've ever really had it, although there certainly have been days when it's felt like that. But it seems to me there's a probable dialectic between the need to write and the inability to write. Because one wouldn't feel the inability if one didn't also feel the need.
As a journalist, you're not allowed to have writer's block. It's right. You can't do it. It's not. You can't.
No?
But it is. It's a discipline, I think, and even if you have that experience, I think.
To write even when you're blocked.
Even when you're blocked, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I've already laid out that on whatever dimensions it has, like I feel pleasure in writing, ordinary pleasure, but pretty predictable. But then there's this other part of it where it's like, even if it's just a notation, writing a diary, for me, they're more notational. I like Marie McLean's got a great chapter in My Poetics that's about notational poetics and ends up talking about haikus, but also the haibun, which is like the poem and the ligatures, the prose part, but all art. That notational poetics, I definitely have had, as a writer and a person, the feeling of not responding, just the simple call of having, smell while you're cooking and you get the language for it, or just, usually it's just a few words, but it could potentially be expanded, like bouillon or whatever, and I just won't write it down. Or I'll have a dream and I won't write it down. And then I believe in the muse or inspiration to this extent, that if I don't write it down for a couple of days, I won't get the call as often. And so it's not writer's block, but it's that sense of just a very ordinary moment, and then if I've said no to it, even if the outcome is only just writing in literally this notebook. And then it doesn't come calling. Marianne Moore has this great quotation from one of her critical essays. I think it's one, I've written the title because it's so wonderful, called Humility, Concentration, and Gusto. And Moore says, yeah, the third is gusto, the romantic term from Hazlitt. Moore says, the thing is to see the vision and not deny it, to care and admit that we do. And that's not even a quote about writing, but I feel like it gets at the heart of what I would say about writing, which is just like, write it down, like stay with it. Because if you say no, it won't come back. The next time it won't come back. And in that sense, it's almost like a relationship going bad, where it's like an important relationship going bad, where it's like if you don't take care, it erodes.
Or like a muscle. I think of it as a muscle.
Like a muscle,
When there's a
that's good.
break imposed by the world or circumstance, and it can be rather hard to reactivate it sometimes.
Totally.
And I also think I love that formulation about pleasure, but I don't know if it's always entirely unmitigatedly pleasurable. I think that you have to experience times of displeasure, really, or unpleasure, whatever that word is.
I secretly think all depressives are better writers than I am, certainly.
There you
All
go.
the what?
Depressives.
But this idea of writer's block, not to defend it as a good thing in the world, but an editor once said to me, only write a book that's necessary. Something that you feel you absolutely, utterly have to write and no choice. And that in those cases, the writer's block tends to not be as strong because it's like an emanation. You're pouring it onto the page. Maybe sometimes some books that are written for the sake of writing don't have that urgency and necessity, and maybe that's when the danger of the block is there, or maybe the block is a good dam to keep out unnecessary books. I don't know. It's been an article of faith for me in that I try to ask myself each time I write a book, do I really need to write this book?
I've heard that same formulation both from an editor and from a very experienced Italian writer I know. And I think that's more in the category of compulsion, though I'm not sure I love that term, with all due respect. But I think it's this, I remember this editor saying to me, you can tell when a book had to come out of somebody. And I've thought about my own books, and I'm slow, but they've had to come out of me, and then this Italian writer I know also phrased it differently, but it was like he could smell a book that had that kind of urgency to it. And so I think we all know what that means. Like we recognize it. You recognize it when you read it sometimes, a book that just there's a kind of something happens in it, that it has a kind of propulsive energy. It may not be about speed or tautness, but it's like that Philip Roth harangue, you can hear this person in your ear who is going to have to talk to you and keep you planted in place for a certain amount of time until you've finished hearing his or her story.
I wonder if it has to do with thought also, the movement, following the movement of thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, or not knowing where it's going. The other thing we haven't talked about is it's as though all this is also, prepared, like, okay, I'm going to get up, have my tea, have my pleasure, and continue writing. And really, it's like if you're me, you don't always have an idea of what's coming next. And you have to live in that uncertainty. You have to live in that silence. You have to live in that anxiety. And also find out. I think for me, one of the pleasures is actually finding out what I'm thinking, not knowing.
Yeah.
Or
not knowing.
Or finding out what happened.
Right, or how to tell it. And particularly writing fiction, you can have a wonderful idea for a novel, but that's one thing. That's 5 minutes, or a minute maybe, or 5 months. But sitting down and making it, building it daily, and sustaining that energy, that tension is an entirely different experience.
But I even think from something that happened to you,
Similarly, also
you
in
write
memoir.
it in order to find out what happened to you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which is odd, but
Not at
So
all.
writing,
True.
right? It gives you a grounding. Yeah, you're not creating, but you're establishing your reality. You're finding it. You're discovering it.
Well, you are creating it in a
Yeah.
way because what happens to us is one thing, but putting it in language is another. You know,
Right.
and putting it into language when you're one age and then another after that. You know, Adam Phillips writing about Winnicott once, in some riff of his there, said, you know, it's interesting how we come out of childhood with, and you think about it, with like 2 hands full of very specific memories that you keep returning to all your life. The memories aren't changing, I don't think, as much as you are changing, and you go back and look at them with everything that you've lived. And that happens to me all the time, and I'm kind of stupefied. Like, why did that thing sink in? It was as though it was waiting for an older version of me to go back and figure it out. And I find that an almost mystical experience. That, for me, is really a core reason of why I write, I have to say.
The mystery is really big.
Yeah.
And why we all
Yeah.
write. I mean,
You know, building on that, I was thinking something Paul said earlier about we're not talking about reading, but one thing that comes up whenever we have an undergraduate study creative writing, and I'm on the board sometime, even though I'm in the lit program, and we all know this because it's kind of what a lot of us do for a living, but writing is one thing that you have to be, in other words, you can be a prodigy in music, right? You can just somehow play phenomenally well at 8 or 10 or whatever, and not having studied music your whole life, or be a virtuoso in math at a young age. But to be a great writer, to qualify for that label, you have to do a ton of reading. That's sort of the given. We always say to anyone who wants to be a poet or a novelist or a writer, go read a bunch of books. What do you make of that connection? I throw it to the group. In other words, is saying, why do we write or why do I write, very similar to saying, why do we have to do a lot of reading to become writers? They seem fundamentally related in a way, maybe not so much in the other arts where you can have certainly you have to know the history of painting and music at some point, but with writing, it's different. There's very few, prodigy novelists at 9 years old.
I think that you don't have to read.
Is that right?
Really?
I do. I mean, poetry comes out of children. I mean, I don't think you have to read anything. I mean, I think you need to know the language. I think you need your own language.
Right.
But I think reading sometimes can hinder the work in a way that I think, I mean, wouldn't it, I mean, you don't have to read Proust. You don't have to, you can just, if you're expressing yourself
Right.
in the most honest way, like, I don't think reading is...
Well, sometimes once you get going, it's nice. I mean, I was going to say that reading other writers, it's a conversation. I mean, I say to my students, writing is a conversation that began at the beginning of writing, and everybody's responding back. We're still responding to Homer or, Sophocles or somebody, so it's a conversation. I think sometimes in my own work, I'll wait to read something until I'm sort of into my own conception, voice, music, whatever. And then I'll say, oh, that's fair. If I remember I should read Jane Austen, or I should read, and see how that person dealt with that kind of material.
I think there might be a division between poetry and prose in this one, because I think the poets can erupt that way. I mean, we have seen a lot of that, poets in their 20s and their teens. But I think prose is I think prose might need a little reading under it. I don't know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, subject, verb, object.
A little bit like that.
Well, you need to acclimatize yourself as fully as possible, both as a reader and as a writer, with all the ranges and flexibilities of the language you're writing in. And I would, just to throw out another notion, suggest that there's a possible ultimate frustration in that. that language can signify, always signifies, from the very beginning, in its most imperfect forms, signifies, and in its finest and most subtle forms, still signifies. And the day comes when you say to yourself, wouldn't it be wonderful not to signify? Wouldn't it be wonderful to find some means of expression concerning which there was nothing at stake, concerning which one only wanted to say what is there in an unmediated way? Wallace Stevens has a poem that ends, where was it one first heard of the truth, the. And of course, that's still signifying. But it's also expressing a frustration at the one way in which we can speak of the limits of language. Language can never not signify. And I think of that as a potential frustration precisely for the virtuoso, for the person most skillfully versed in the possibilities and registers of language. Suddenly to come to the realization that the one limit standing between this person and originality, let's say, is the fact that I can't stop signifying.
I don't know, Ms. Stein doesn't always signify, dare I say.
Marianne Moore really got at it, didn't she?
Well, and, you know, the whole struggle of writing a poem is to try not to, is to try to bang your language into a shape that surprises rather than
Yes.
first, rather than
Yeah.
telling about. So it's that a poem is, it's not about, But I even think that's interesting to try and do in prose. Because there are different kinds of prose. I mean, there's journalistic prose, which is, about, it has its job. And I'm always talking to my students about the difference between journalism and creative nonfiction. We used to all say, oh, what's creative nonfiction? Now I sort of know what it is. It's applying a certain amount of creativity to what you're writing so that and I say it's not a documentary. So what are you going to do with it? How are you going to make the thing? And so maybe it's the kind of effort to go against signifying that is one of the spurs of writing, of trying to write well.
And the other kinds of if we really go with this maker thing, and I love the reminder that fiction is that too.
Yeah.
Then making and signifying don't necessarily have to.
Right.
All the other things that craftspeople make don't have to signify. Language stands out as the one that's so embedded in our cognition, in our sociality, and maybe in something like species being anthropologically, that it can't help but having that alignment, even if we don't want it. That's one reason why I worked on Stanley Cavell's philosophy for 10 years, out of this sense that we're all just say, and that's the human predicament of being given to meaning.
Well, that's at the other side of that.
You're right. Yeah, I think
Can
so.
you say a little more about that?
Oh my gosh, can I?
What we said.
Not
Well-
10 years worth, but just
Saying more than you mean. I love that.
Here's the bibliographic comment, which is just, Stanley Cavell, great philosopher, taught at Harvard forever, passed away about 5-6 years ago. His first collection of essays, which I urge you all to check out, is called Must We Mean What We Say? And simply the conundrum of how to interpret that, or even just how to respond to that, what that's doing, what that means. A lot of it is about the way in which, we are linguistic beings and are both find each other and are distant from each other in our language. And Freud says the same thing. Our language overcommits us to others. Think of the unconscious in Freud, we're constantly slipping and giving away our meaning too much, or giving away meaning maybe we don't recognize it as ours. And so that sense that not being able to turn signification off, I think is one thing that maybe it's just a certain kind of writing, maybe it's a certain kind of literary theoretical writing, but I don't think so. Like, writers want to make things, and there's the impulse almost toward muteness or toward just like making something that stands in the world the same way other objects and crafted things
Right.
do. And language simply can't do that. It can't not emit, right?
Like acting.
It always gives it away. It always gives away a lot.
Yeah, I find myself thinking about acting because a performer can convey so much without using language. It just makes me insane. Like, I think it's just not fair, because I'm in the process of adapting my first book as a possible play, and I'm so tired of the words. It's like, can't the actor just embody that thing with a few hints underneath, like a little direction, like you would do in a screenplay more predictably? But back in the stage, you're back in the world of this need to,
Yeah. That's why so many
But I think
poets
the
wrote
answer to
poems
that
about
is
Buster
yes.
what?
I think the actor can do certain things without words.
Exactly, and I'm jealous. I look at that sometimes, the economy of it, that little twitch in the face that you will spend like days trying to get a paragraph that will convey that.
But in a screenplay, you can just
Yes, you can.
suggest that.
Yeah, you can suggest it, but again, you don't have quite the control you do in a play or in a book. So some of us don't love that.
collaboration.
Yes, exactly.
But that's when we get to the question of where did the oral tradition turn into the written? Like, why would they even go there? And
Exactly.
because they
yeah.
were doing it all with their acting and their
Well, and their
their
oral storytelling.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what, yeah.
You know, Elizabeth, just to go back to the point you were making about the discipline of writing and the way in which journalists can't afford to have writer's block. I think this is also true for a good many novelists who put themselves under comparable regimens. I'm going to get up this morning and I'm going to write 5 pages, come hell or high water, inspired or not, good, bad, or indifferent, and I'm going to keep doing it day after day after day. And there's virtue in the very slogging of this process. And that too has interesting results. But what I would say, it's keeping writer's block at bay.
That, exactly, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a muscle, right? So, I mean, even if you're even if you're not that amazing young woman skating the other day, you're still exercising the muscle.
Right.
If you keep slogging.
Right.
And I think Flannery O'Connor said, I don't know if I'm going to get a story, but I know if I'm sitting at my desk, I'll be there to receive it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And I love that,
Yeah.
But for just as many writers who are in that modality, Philip Roth every day, Graham Greene 500 words,
Yep.
then you have Virginia Woolf who will finish a novel and have a nervous breakdown, or we'll go to France, and we'll go away from it for a while. So in the same way that there's not just one book to write, I think there's just not one way to go about writing them.
Are there writers that have block and writers that have boredom? I was reading, John Ashbery, of course, talks about this, or actually I was reading a great collection, Madness, Rack, and Honey, and boredom is really important to that. I have a note on that if you want to hear it, but like this sense that welcoming boredom and boredom being, of course, useless, of course it's got to be wasted, but being and I wonder if that's just a different mood from writer's block, or if there are different writers that make use of boredom in ways that just are kind of therapeutically better, or maybe even artistically more generative than writer's block, which to me, the genuine thing about that is that by definition, it's not remunerative, right? It's just block. It even makes me feel kind of yucky to say it because it has such a
Horrible connotation.
yeah.
But what do you mean, boredom? I mean, exactly.
Yeah, I can't get my head
I
around
don't know.
that.
I want to
As
piggyback
an-
on what it's
in-
Mary Ruffalo and John Ashbery that I'm trying to piggyback on here. But I guess I don't know.
Well, what do you mean about
being a writer is not a purposeful, even if it is our mode of employment, in various ways. It is decoupled from most utilitarian or directly utilitarian forms, and so it's already kind of linked to idling and boredom.
But do you mean they try to write boringly? I mean, what do you exactly?
Did you hit a
I'm just-
boring patch or
What
something?
I sort of mean, like very practically, is like I was reading in this great Madness, Rack, and Honey essay by Mary Ruffo, and she quotes a grant application. I'm assuming this is actual, where she writes, this sounds like it was from a bygone era. I need a stretch of uninterrupted time, free of distraction, so that I can be open to distraction and be bored so that I can,
Well,
But that use of boredom is very clear.
That's
because
important.
that's different.
That's
it's more
a refuge.
generative.
Necessary. I don't know if generative is the word, but I think this thing happens sometimes that I've used to torment me, but I've come to make better friends with it with some experience, which is that you will sit there are days you will sit there, and it just won't happen. And it won't happen. And then I forget that I shouldn't be sitting there, because the minute I get up and leave, then something comes. So I think that but that time of immobility sometimes can be incredibly useful. It's Adam Moss did this book about, he interviewed 100 different creative people and asked them, like, where do they get their inspiration? It's like a very, very basic sort of question. But one recurring theme, I heard him talk about this in a podcast, was that when people are in motion, they find the inspiration or the problems. I don't know if any of you has had this, whether walking or swimming or bicycling, not driving. Trains, okay. I thought it was a more active, like something in the physical, but
Trains,
that
you got all
happened.
that stuff coming beside you.
Why moving? It's a very interesting question.
Well, you're moving your muscles, and that changes your
Well, you're out of your head. Maybe you're out of your head a little bit.
Right.
Not on a train. You're not really moving your muscles unless you're pacing.
Your eyes are scanning.
Your eyes are
Lots
scanning
of
this.
rapid eye movement.
I think in the case of Wordsworth, who wrote most of his poetry while walking, the poetry is so heavily iambic, and walking is in some sense iambic as well, that I think he found a rhythm. And of course, we're talking about a writer who didn't write. He ran home and wrote down what he had composed without pen and pencil while walking. So,
Dickens, the same, right? He was
Yeah.
creating his characters and,
yeah.
He was a night walker.
right.
He was?
The night is an interesting time. Like Cynthia Ozick, for a long time, I think, wrote all night long and then slept until noon. I think that's fascinating. I don't have that metabolism, but I sometimes feel like that might be a secret there.
But I think the key is, whether you're a night person or a morning person, most writers I talk to have a ritual. And you get into that, what's Goethe's famous line, do not hurry, do not rest. You're kind of, you're working at a set time, you go back into the real world, you come back to your desk, and within that rhythm, you find your writing space. But I just being a person, I write every morning, first thing, just for a few hours, and that's when my brain is freshest and it's the hard work of the day. But it's only a few hours. It's not. And most writers I talk to don't write 8 hours a day. They write 3 or 4 at the most.
Faulkner used to say, what am I going to do with the rest of my day other than drink? You know, I mean, that was how he justified his alcoholism. I can't write all day, so I have to start drinking.
But there is something,
Same with the painters, yeah.
Yeah.
something about that rhythm of work and non-work that I think is.
We've drifted away from why, and now it's how. Have you
Right.
noticed?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like
But-
how is so much easier than why.
But there's later in the day, there's the editing process and so are you talking about the generative process?
Can we go back to Wordsworth for a second?
Sure.
So Wordsworth wrote his great stuff, most of it before he was around, when he was a young man.
Well, the Great Decade
yeah,
takes you up to roughly 30,
30 or
28 or
so.
30. Yeah.
And then there were long decades where he still produced work, but it wasn't, he did work on his autobiographical poem during that time, but the muse wasn't there. So you can have all the rhythms and the regimes, but you have to somehow still be inspired.
I think you have to shift your paradigm or something. You have to kind of just decide to start again or
Yeah.
say I'm not writing out of that, but what am I writing out of, and kind of figure out what it is or something?
I mean, I think writing is, this is very podcasty of me. Writing is very like costly, like it's resource costly, even though it's sort of what we do just as people. Like I think it burns a lot of calories, right? And writing well probably like, I mean, you guys tell me, but like writing well probably exhausts or at least externalizes like a key part of a creative self for that time. And it's a costly.
I think there's the other side is maybe the relief factor that we haven't talked about. Relief of burdens, traumas that writers often write. That's the reason they write to, and that would be sort of the opposite in a way. It would be, rather than costly, it would be reconstituting and a huge psychological. Do you think?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm also wondering so there are writers, maybe Wordsworth was one of these, although arguments we made he's not. It's just we don't have the taste for his very productive, interesting later work. But like, you know, if you're writing to externalize something that really kind of made you, and then you get it done, that could be a once-in-a-lifetime thing.
Right.
And then there's like the mystery of that recharge of energy, right? Like new energy. I've been thinking about Frank O'Hara being in the city, you know, like that, just that solar metabolic mystery of the recharge of energy for writing. And I think different kinds of writers have different temperaments for those things.
And each project might do something different. I mean, Virginia Woolf said famously that she was haunted by her mother's death. She was 13 when she died, and she was like 40 when she published To the Lighthouse, and that was a long stretch of wrangling with and living with, and that she stopped being haunted by her afterward. You know, is that the model for all of us? I don't know. I don't know if it quite works like that in the real world. It seemed to for her, but then she could write Flush. You know, it's like they're like different species altogether.
And didn't the book that cost Woolf the most, that she finished just before she died,
Between the Acts.
end up not being one of her best? Like that sense of like the expenditure didn't align with the aesthetic value. It's really interesting.
Well, that was sort of the whole, I mean, it was the years, right?
It was the years.
I thought it was Between the Acts was the last book.
What?
I thought it was
Between the
Between the Acts.
Yeah, that's not unfinished. I think you're right.
Is that the unfinished?
That's a great book, so I
It's
take
a
it back.
masterpiece.
But there was The Years, which is
The
sort
Years
of
was that-
almost
that's
a
the
more
book.
Edwardian book,
Yes, I
strangely.
think that was earlier,
Okay.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yes, of course, the effort that you pour in doesn't necessarily going to relieve you of I mean, there's
It
so many
could
things to
kill
say
you,
about her.
right? It could kill you.
Yeah. Say it again?
It could kill you.
It could kill you. Yeah.
I have really found that to be true, that certain conflicts are resolved. I don't, you know,
Like, do you think back about your childhood, and do you think of it does it weigh on you the same way?
no,
No.
definitely not.
Yeah.
You know, definitely not.
Yeah, was it in the writing of or in the world reading of, or both?
No, it wasn't in the world reading. It's in the writing. It's in the figuring out what happened and making something of it. And it's, phew, I now understand that. I don't have to worry about it.
And do you think your understanding of it is definitive? Sorry, as a memoir writer, I always have these questions.
Whatever definitive means, maybe you know, if you wrote a book 30 years ago, then you might write it differently now, but
Or does it depend where you are in your life? Because as I've gotten to the
course.
age of some of the people I've written about, I've come to see them slightly differently,
Yeah.
I have to say, which means maybe one just never publishes anything, and like Harold Broadkey just keeps going back and writing and writing and writing until you get it.
well, I just sort of look back. I mean, my first nonfiction book was out about my grandmother, who was a painter.
Yes, right.
Who died when she was 86. I just turned 80. That's different from starting a book when I was 35, 36.
Would you write that story differently now?
I don't think maybe I'd write it.
Okay.
I mean, I really wanted to understand, in the case of her, I wanted to understand, the moment that made me write the book was that I knew that she had stopped painting. And I said, why did you stop? And she said, it got too intense. And it was like, oh, I have to find out what that means. And I did.
But it seems to me, for why we write also applies to people who are not writers. So sometimes I may jot down an experience that I've had, and it's not for anybody else. It's just an experience, and I feel I should, as opposed to other experiences, I should have write down that experience.
Why?
I have no idea. I just some experiences. And the same, I think, occasionally I have certain emotions, and I say I'm not a poet or anything, but I say I write a poem. I write 10 lines, 5 lines, and somehow I feel it communicates the emotion I'm having. And then I put it away. I may find it 5, 6 years later in one of the drawers, but there's no other purpose. And then there's another way of writing, which is in my field. I have started for some years questioning Freud. So I wrote a couple of papers to present to psychoanalysts, but then I decided, why did this happen and how did this happen? What was the evolution? And so I started writing an actual book, which is called, which will come out soon, but it's called The End of Freud with a question mark. So I'm not a writer. I don't have any other psychoanalyst working in my office. So there are other impulses that make one write. And I think when Paul earlier was saying he writes, well, he doesn't write for anybody to read it or anything. It's part of that. You have experiences and you want to record them. You just want to put them down.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that, going back to the question of memoir, when I think back to a very personal book I wrote about how Dante, reading the Divine Comedy, helped me get through a death of someone very close to me, was that the book wasn't written for therapeutic reasons or anything like that, but it was a traumatic experience. And writing the book was unbelievably challenging because you don't want to really go there. But if you're going to write a memoir, you got to go there. You got to lift up the hood and start tinkering with the engine, and you got to let it fly or don't write it. And after a lot of false starts, I wrote it. And I really wrote it, and to the best of my abilities. And it was a way to deal with this death that I couldn't have done just as a human being. Right? I wrote it. That wasn't why I wrote the book, but it became sort of part of the process of grief and mourning. And then it was over, and it no longer belonged to me.
Right.
And it's a strange feeling. It's like a part of you dies along with the book. And you let it go, and you just, it exists.
You grieve.
So is that...
It exists outside of you.
That's positive. It sounds negative, but there's
No, it
maybe a
wasn't negative.
positive side.
It was
as
a
well.
positive.
And emptying out is
emptying out.
cathartic or purgatorial.
When my father died, my mother, who was poorly educated because when she was a young girl, her mother died, and they pulled her out of the school to take care of the younger siblings. But so she was I never saw her write before. When my father died, every day she sat down and she wrote about her life from early on through the relationship with my father until his death. And then she was fine. Similar, it was a way to deal with the grief and the mourning.
I'm reminded that we have company here as well, and so I thought maybe with the time that remains, we could open it up for some questions if people in the audience would like to approach the microphone. If anyone has a question for the roundtable to consider. Oh, here we go. Is the microphone on already?
So, nice and tall, good.
Great.
So all of you obviously write and make a living at writing. Some of you teach. I'm interested in, for the rest of us, we all in our own lives communicate and we write, we talk, and maybe if you're an actor, there's other ways to express, but I'm just struck with how damn hard writing is at the professional level. I mean, there's just no question about it. And then I think of my own life as just a regular person, and I text, I write reports, I read terrible writing, things that have been put together, and it's just so bad that, there's an enormous gap. Anyway, I actually was my undergraduate, I was an English literature major, and I have thought many years, why did I major in that? I don't regret it, it was great. I think part of writing is you got to read good stuff, but writing also takes work and practice. And I'm just in appreciation to all of you. If you can't write well, you're out of business. You're out of luck. I am a graduate of Mr. Fry's alma mater, and I do remember that as a student, the main purpose was read the works and what does it mean, and that's what the teachers worked on. But the whole department didn't let you off the hook. Yeah, you got it right, but this could have been written better. But it wasn't like you got to do better. It was more of a nugget of it. You should want to write better. So I thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
That's beautiful.
More for the word.
You could always write
all
better.
Panelists. I don't want to create any feedback. As a side note, this panel made me think of a Kafka quote that was something like, "A writer who doesn't write is a monster courting insanity," which, but so I know the guiding question for this panel was why we write, but we can't really separate that from writing being an outcome-driven process. I think that all of your answers have kind of gone to, we write towards having this product, right? So, and I get the feeling that your answers will be very different coming from each of the panelists. That begs the question for me, what constitutes good writing? And if we are to write, is it always to produce good writing, or is it sometimes just for the sake of writing?
Great question.
Good.
I would say, from personal experience, that it's not always to produce good writing. I hope it's not anyway. Because I really do feel very strongly that there's something mechanical built into the kind of need that I'm talking about. That when you use words like scribble or doodle, you're saying something about the writing process which is not irrelevant, but and that's of course where media history may come in too, because needless to say, at different periods in the history of writing, we have had different orientations toward the gesture itself. But I do think very strongly that when we write, we often write in hopes of excellence, but we also write, maybe even in those same moments, and possibly in other moments too, simply because we have to write.
Also, a lot of bad writing precedes good writing, for me anyway. I mean, I throw a lot of things away. I think that's very healthy or necessary.
Is it time to quote T.S. Eliot?
Go ahead.
Whenever I think I've written a particularly fine sentence, I throw it into the fire.
I do think there's another side, though, in the sense that the first gentleman who spoke mentioned that we do it for a living and we write books and whatnot. There is the professional side of writing where if you work with a rigorous editor, or if you you know, you spend hundreds and thousands of hours on a book. The outcome, you expect it to be at a certain level. And it's, I mean, I played tennis my whole life. I love tennis, and I can grade myself progress over the years. But writing, you know, I'm not a pro tennis player, as much as I'd love to be. Writing for publication is you have to get it to a certain point. And that's a demanding process, but it's a really meaningful one when you have lifted the prose, so to speak, up to the level where it can be considered publishable and well-received.
A related question might be, why do we revise?
That's the fun part.
Yeah, someone
You're over
said
the writer's block.
someone said I have to put on another persona when I edit because it's such a different
Yeah.
process. It's taking out the creative process
Right.
and it's for me I don't like it that much,
Maybe-
but it takes
yeah.
double the amount of time. Actually.
That's basically the answer to the question is
Yeah.
revision, endless revision.
Yeah.
So much you
endless.
can't count.
You can't count, and it's hard to describe how much revision goes into the finished product.
Back to Virginia Woolf, the last thing she wrote before she died was an essay. There were 7 drafts found in her drawer the week that she committed suicide. Only 7. And then there's Mr. Roth, who says, you know, it's the only profession in which accumulated experience means nothing, because every time you start, you're starting over. And that really is true. I think that's a little bit playful maybe in his case, but I do understand that in the deepest level. You are looking at this void and trying to figure out what story is going to make its way into it. And the stories you've told before can only help to a point, I think. You know?
Well, and then there's the syndrome of starting the next thing, and what you're really doing is going on with the last thing, you know, in some way, and you have to, oh no, I have to start again.
We have another question. 2 more.
Okay. I'm a painter and a historian, and I used to write, and I was perplexed by how do you choose which art form to endeavor in if they all appeal to you in some way. And I found at first with words that I had a vocabulary. I had a given vocabulary. I wasn't going to use it literally, but I found with painting, especially in this time and especially in the 20th century, that the vocabulary is to be found. Of course, it's part of a long tradition, but the terrifying thing in painting is you have a white canvas and you start without the given, which you have the given. And of course there's a tradition, and we all painters belong to a certain tribe and they follow, but still there is an element of experimentation and risk and failure, if you wish that word, but in terms of what you're going into. So I'm very fascinated to hear all of you speak about the nature of writing, and I'm thinking about painting, and I'm thinking you're lucky in some ways. You have this given vocabulary. Of course, you have to have talent to know how to sift it and change it and various things, but it is interesting to see, and we should have more interdisciplinary work, because painting is sort of in between in some ways, maybe even more music and to some extent poetry. Writing has other analogies. And I was thinking another thought too. A lot of painters of the last 50 years have spoken about painting as a religion, a new religion, and often they'll put their easel up on their painting. They'll paint their easel as the god, because the creative act becomes a kind of spiritual revelation. And there's also in painting, and this is true also probably in writing, a sense of tribe. You belong to certain pictorial traditions. Keep looking just as you keep reading. So it's very interesting just to hear this process, but if you go into then the painting process, you can see a little more about how you are really fighting against the unknown. That's all, yeah.
And I know, Paul, you are our resident writer and painter. Is there anyone else here in the group who does
I just wanted to
both?
say, I'm always envious of painters, because I think, oh my God, a canvas and paint? And I don't have to worry about all those words?
Not a lot more to worry about.
No, I'm sure. That's a joke. but-
I'll just say one thing, expressing the frustration of being a not terribly strong painter. And that is that I do mostly abstract painting. And I maybe in the tradition of what I grew up with, which was abstract expressionism. And my experience, the frustration, is that once I have covered the white canvas, I find myself surrounded by conventions that I can't get away from, compositional choices that I wish could be made in a different way, but I can't figure out how to make them in a different way. So I find myself perpetually falling into what, let's say, cliches of composition. And that's a frustration that I feel much more strongly in painting than I do in writing. It may be that I'm a better writer, but I do think it may reflect on a difference between the two media.
Well, I think when you think you go back to conventions in painting, as soon as you get to that point, painters speak about getting through that. In other words, it's not what you do in the beginning. It's what begins to happen that you don't know. You have an idea in your head, and then as you're working, other things happen. And you have to take those things on. So there's a tremendous freedom once you pass that bridge. You have to go through the bridge to get to the point where you have to then take accident. Now, I mean, I don't know, again, with writing, there is a certain amount of accident. There's a lot of accident in painting because you're dealing with material. You're dealing with material that you can't completely manipulate. But I am interested in the idea of abstraction in painting, and how would you relate that to the world of writing? Would there be any equivalent?
So one thing I'll say, and it's related to the conversation with painting, a challenge as a teacher when you're teaching literature and teaching writing is that the students know the language. In other words, so they say, well, I already know how to write because I already know how to use English. They wouldn't say that about painting, right? They'd say, oh, I maybe don't know how to draw.
I'm already human.
I don't know how to sculpt. But I think writing is actually, it cuts both ways. I actually think a true writer knows how to estrange himself from language, where it's no longer familiar, where it's no longer just communication. Like if you think of like the opening of Ulysses, stately plump buck mulligan bearing a bowl of lather. It's kind of English, but it's like English broken down and reconstituted, and there's something alien about it, but it's powerful and it works really well. And it's no longer just communication. It's no longer email. It's text. You have to be able to hear language the way a musician hears
It's
notes.
abstract.
Yeah, there's an abstract quality
Yes.
and there's a music to it. And I think that's about estranging yourself from language as communication.
I'm sorry, we have one more
Yeah.
question.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely, but I may be hallucinating while I've been sitting here for the last hour or so, but there's a very large elephant in this room, and its initials are AI. We haven't heard anybody say that. What's going to happen to all of this as we, seems like, inexorably enter into this new world?
Yeah. Excellent question.
You have to come to the round table in...
Yeah.
We'll have to have a right to write, right? Like we've got these new movements now that are about things that, for which political space needs to be open, like the rights to maintain equipment, the rights to having commons of any kind. We'll have to have because at least I think in this room, it's not just about accomplishing a goal as quickly as possible or sort of, what's the word, offloading. We don't want to offload that labor or that pleasure.
It's a good question, though, because it's threatening.
Oh, yeah.
They're doing it so well, AI. So it's a very, very
One of
good.
the points of the panel was that you often don't know what you're thinking until you've written it. And what happens when that initial
Right.
struggle is taken away for you, even just in terms of the idea generation or something. I'm sorry, we have one more question.
Thank God we're not answering that
I
one.
like to stay away from my AI. I grew up hating to write. And I, when it came to writing my dissertation at UC Berkeley, I had to dictate it into one of those little cassettes because I couldn't tolerate sitting there with my Smith Corona trying to type something. And I think that was the only way that I could get through that first chapter and the second and the third. And it was, I continued to hate to write through training here at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. And I only, I guess at the age of about 75, started to love to write. And that was when I started taking a memoir class. And for the first 3 sessions, I could not write anything. I just listened to what other people wrote. And then I took my little laptop out into Central Park, and I sat there, and it was the first time I'd ever taken my laptop out of my apartment. And I sat down and I wrote just spontaneously, and I handed it in, and I was given a great deal of praise and admiration from my fellow students and my teacher, and suddenly I loved to write. What's the difference there?
Bravo.
Praise doesn't hurt.
Oh, okay, sorry, we have time for 30 seconds.
It's kind of a lightning round question. There's been a lot of great references of different works and quotes and things that I think have made this conversation come to life. So just a quick lightning round. I'd love to hear everybody kind of mention whether it's a quote or a moment or a book or whatever the trigger might be that is most inspiring. Just kind of a quick tidbit is with all the depth of knowledge at this round table would be lovely to hear. Thanks.
Last recommendations. Mike.
Me first. Proust. Commit 7 years, 0.5, and do it. 25 pages a week, 10 months a year, yeah.
Okay, Eric.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been falling in love with James Schuyler, so I'll recommend Schuyler again. But here's a great quote from Frank O'Hara, and I don't know if he means this straight up, but I take this. He writes that quote, "The crossroads where what I know and can't get meets what is left of that I know and can bear without hatred." That's Frank O'Hara.
That's good.
Elizabeth.
Well, I'm volume 3 Proust right now, but also, but James Joyce has always been a touch point for me.
I got to go with Dante. No surprise. I think the Divine Comedy, but the beautiful opening of Paradiso 25, where Dante steps out and says, I'll paraphrase a little bit, should it ever happen, should it ever come to pass, that this sacred poem to which heaven and earth have both set their hands so that it has made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, then I will return at the baptismal font of Florence as poet.
Nice.
Beautiful.
Keats's To Autumn, which I think is a miniature Divine Comedy. 33 lines, I say no more.
To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. I don't know how many times I've taught it, maybe 25, and it is so perfect and beautiful that I highly recommend repeated readings of it.
And I would recommend that we read the writings of our panelists and give them a warm round of applause. And thank you for participating today.